The sky over the city turned a bruised, unnatural violet, choked by plumes of thick, greasy smoke that billowed from the southern district. It was Monday, September 8, 1941, a date that would be etched into the collective memory of 3 million people, not for a great military victory, but for the smell. As the German Luftwaffe released their payloads over the Badev warehouses, the wooden structures, dried out by the summer heat, ignited instantly. Inside those vast depots lay the strategic reserves of the city, tons of flour, oil, and sugar. As the inferno raged, the heat became so intense that the sugar melted, turning into a boiling, caramelized river that flowed into the cellars and saturated the surrounding earth. For days, the air in Leningrad did not smell of cordite or death, but of burnt sugar. It was a sickeningly sweet aroma that masked a horrifying reality. The lifeline of the city had been severed, its pantry incinerated, and the door to the outside world slammed shut. The sweetness in the air was the scent of starvation arriving. Welcome to the beginning of the most harrowing siege in modern history. This is not merely a story of military maneuvers or strategic maps. It is the chronicle of a metropolis slowly suffocating. Before we walk the frozen streets of the famine winter, we must understand how the cradle of the Russian Revolution found itself encircled, isolated, and marked for extinction by the Third Reich. To understand the tragedy of September, we must look back to the longest day of the year. On Sunday, June 22nd, 1941, the citizens of Leningrad were enjoying the phenomenon known as the White Nights. The sun barely dipped below the horizon, casting a twilight glow over the Neva River and the imperial palaces. The theatres were full, and the parks were crowded with families enjoying the summer solstice. At 3:15 in the morning, that peace was shattered not by thunder, but by the roar of Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers, organized into 3 massive army groups, surged across the Soviet border. For Leningrad, the threat came from Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb. Von Lieb was a veteran officer, a traditional Prussian tactician who drove his forces with relentless efficiency. His objective was clear and explicitly stated in the directive from Berlin: destroy the Red Army in the Baltic region, seize the ports to secure the iron ore supply lines from Sweden, and capture Leningrad. The city was not just a military target, it was the ideological symbol of Bolshevism. Hitler had declared that once the city was surrounded, it was to be razed to the ground. In the final days of June, the reality of the invasion had not yet fully penetrated the psyche of the Leningrader. The front lines were still far away in Lithuania and Latvia. However, the speed of the German advance was terrifying. The panzer divisions of the Wehrmacht, supported by the screaming sirens of Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, sliced through Soviet defenses with surgical precision. The Soviet northwestern front collapsed in chaos. By early July, the Germans had crossed the Daugava River, covering hundreds of kilometers in a matter of weeks. The distance between the panzers and the Hermitage Museum was shrinking by the hour. Inside the city, the atmosphere shifted from confusion to frantic mobilization. The Communist Party leadership in Leningrad, led by Andrei Zhdanov, issued a call to arms. It was a mobilization of the entire population. Factory workers, students, teachers, and shopkeepers were organized into the Opolchenie, the People's Militia. These were not trained soldiers. Many went to the front wearing their civilian clothes, armed with outdated rifles or sometimes no weapons at all, instructed to pick up the rifle of a fallen comrade. They were thrown into the path of the most experienced mechanized army in the world. Simultaneously, a massive engineering effort began. Hundreds of thousands of civilians, predominantly women and teenagers, were sent to the outskirts of the city to dig. They were tasked with constructing the Luga Line, a system of anti-tank ditches, trenches, and bunkers stretching nearly 200 miles. Armed with nothing but shovels and spades, working under the summer sun and often under strafing fire from the Luftwaffe, they moved millions of cubic meters of earth. The soil was heavy, often clay-ridden, making the work backbreaking. Blisters turned to calluses, and calluses turned to open wounds. But they kept digging, driven by the propaganda that the city of Peter the Great would never fall. Despite these heroic efforts, the Luga Line could only delay, not stop, the German advance. The forces of von Lieb were professional and adaptable. By August, the fighting had reached the outskirts of the city. The sounds of artillery, once a distant rumble, became a constant, rhythmic thudding that rattled the windows of the Winter Palace. The rail lines, the arteries that pumped food and ammunition into the city, began to be severed one by one. On August 21st, the Germans captured Chudovo, cutting the main rail link between Moscow and Leningrad. The city was now dependent on secondary lines and northern routes. The noose was tightening. Inside the city, the population had swelled. Refugees from the Baltic states and the surrounding countryside had fled into Leningrad, seeking safety, unaware that they were running into a trap. The pre-war population of roughly 2.5 million had increased, adding more mouths to feed just as the supply chains were breaking. By the first week of September, the situation was critical. The German 18th Army approached from the south and west, while Finnish forces, allies of Germany seeking to reclaim territory lost in the Winter War, pressed down from the north on the Karelian Isthmus. Leningrad was being squeezed into a narrow pocket against the Gulf of Finland. Then came the catastrophic failure at Schlisselburg. Located east of Leningrad, where the Neva River flows out of Lake Ladoga, Schlisselburg was the final bolt in the lock. On September 8th, German tanks from the 20th Motorized Division broke through the Soviet defences and captured the town. With the fall of Schlisselburg, the last overland route to the rest of the Soviet Union was cut. The encirclement was complete. The city was physically isolated from the mainland. The only way in or out was across the waters of Lake Ladoga or through the air, both of which were dominated by the Luftwaffe. It was on this very day, September 8th, that the Luftwaffe launched the massive raid targeting the Bardev warehouses. The logic of the German High Command was shifting. Originally, the plan had been to storm the city and take it by force. However, the Soviet resistance had been fiercer than anticipated. The militia units, despite their lack of training, fought with suicidal tenacity. Every street and basement was being fortified. Von Lieb realized that fighting house to house in a dense urban environment would bleed his army dry, costing him the armored divisions needed for the push toward Moscow. In Berlin, a darker decision was made. Adolf Hitler issued Directive No. 1601. The order was chilling in its bureaucratic coldness. The Führer decided that the city would not be stormed. Instead, it would be besieged. The directive explicitly stated that requests for surrender were to be rejected. The German forces were to seal off the city, destroy its infrastructure with artillery and aerial bombardment, and let general hunger do the rest. The objective was the complete depopulation of Leningrad. They intended to starve millions of people to death as a matter of policy. The destruction of the Bardev warehouses was the opening salvo of this strategy. The visual impact of the fire on the population was devastating. As the black smoke blotted out the sun, rumors spread instantly. People whispered that the food was gone, that the authorities had failed, that the end was near. The psychological blow was as damaging as the physical loss. While official Soviet propaganda tried to downplay the extent of the damage, claiming that the supplies were dispersed, the citizens could smell the truth. In the days following the fire, a strange and desperate phenomenon occurred. People began to sneak into the ruins of the Bardev district. The ground where the molten sugar had soaked into the soil became a prize. Famished civilians would dig up the sweet earth, packing the black, sugar-saturated dirt into sacks and pockets. Later, at home, they would boil this dirt, straining the muddy water through cloth to extract a dark, gritty syrup. It was the first sign that the veneer of civilization was cracking, replaced by the primal urge to consume calories in any form available. With the ring closed, the Soviet authorities immediately instituted strict rationing. The administration of the city, under Zhdanov, took stock of the remaining supplies, and the numbers were terrifying. On September 12th, just 4 days after the encirclement, the calculations showed they had flour for 35 days, cereals for 30 days, meat for 33 days, and fats for 45 days. And this was assuming current consumption rates, which were already being slashed. There was almost no coal or oil. The ration cards became the most valuable document in a life of a person, more important than a passport or money. The population was divided into categories: manual workers, those essential to the war effort and factory production, received the highest tier. Office workers, children, and dependents received significantly less. In September, the bread ration for workers was set at 600 grams per day. For employees and children, it was 400 grams. This was meager, but survivable. It was roughly equivalent to a few standard slices of bread, but this bread was changing. The bakeries of Leningrad, running low on rye and wheat flour, began to experiment with additives. At first, it was simple extenders, like bran, but as the flour stocks dwindled rapidly in October, the recipes became more desperate. The siege bread began to include ingredients that had no place in human digestion. They added malt cake, a byproduct of brewing. They added soybean flour. As the situation worsened, they introduced cellulose edible wood pulp, normally used in paper production. The bread became heavy, damp, and dark. It had the consistency of clay and tasted bitter. When you squeezed a piece, water would drip out of it. It sat in the stomach like a stone, providing fullness but little nutrition. As October 1941 progressed, the reality of the siege settled in. The initial adrenaline of the invasion faded into a dull, gnawing anxiety. The city was being systematically dismantled by German artillery. The heavy guns, positioned in the southern suburbs, began a routine bombardment. They targeted not just military installations, but civilians. They fired at tram stops during rush hour. They targeted schools and hospitals. The shelling was random and psychological, designed to prevent any sense of safety. Signs began to appear on the Nevsky Prospect, stenciled in blue paint on the sides of buildings. Citizens. During shelling, this side of the street is the most dangerous. The weather, too, began to turn against the city. In a cruel twist of fate, the winter of 1941 to 1942 was destined to be one of the coldest on record in Russia. By mid-October, the first frosts appeared. The ground hardened, making it difficult to dig graves or trenches. The temperature dropped steadily, and the lack of fuel became an immediate crisis. The central heating systems in the grand apartment blocks of Leningrad ceased to function. There was no coal to run the boilers. Inside the apartments, the temperature equalized with the temperature outside. People began to live in their coats. They slept under piles of blankets, rugs, and curtains. The burzhoika, a small, makeshift wood-burning stove, became the center of the household. These stoves were inefficient and required constant fuel. Furniture began to disappear. First the spare chairs, then the tables, then the books. The libraries of the intelligentsia went up in smoke to boil a kettle of water. In the markets, money ceased to have meaning. The ruble collapsed. The economy reverted to a primitive barter system. A loaf of bread could buy a gold watch. A liter of oil could buy a grand piano. Though no one wanted a piano, you could not burn it efficiently. The only currency that mattered was food. The market was a dangerous place, filled with shadows and desperation, where people traded heirlooms for potato peels or linseed cake intended for cattle. As November approached, the ration was cut again. And again. The math was relentless. There was no incoming supply. The barges that attempted to cross Lake Ladoga faced constant storms and Luftwaffe attacks. Many were sunk, taking their precious cargo of grain to the bottom of the lake. The city was eating itself. On November 20th, a date that marked the descent into the abyss, the ration was slashed to its lowest point yet. Workers were reduced to 250 grams of bread. Dependents and children were cut to 125 grams. 125 grams. Visualizing this is difficult for the modern mind. It is a slice of bread the size of a small bar of soap. It was a dense, sticky, brownish-black lump. This was the total caloric intake for a human being for 24 hours. There was no soup, no meat, no vegetables, just this small, adulterated brick of cellulose and dust. The physiological effects of this deprivation began to manifest rapidly. The condition was clinically known as alimentary dystrophy starvation disease. It started with weight loss, the body consuming its own fat reserves. Once the fat was gone, the body began to consume muscle. Faces became gaunt, eyes sunken and overly large. Skin became dry and papery, often turning a greyish or earthen colour. But then, a deceptive phase would set in. The body, failing to process fluids, would begin to swell. Edema caused legs and bellies to bloat. People looked misleadingly full, but their flesh was soft and retained the imprint of a finger if pressed. This swelling made movement agonizing. Walking became a slow, shuffling ordeal. The energy required to lift a foot or climb a flight of stairs was immense. The mental state of the population shifted. The vibrant, intellectual energy of Leningrad was replaced by a singular, obsessive focus on food. Conversations revolved around meals of the past. People kept diaries detailing exactly what they had eaten and what they dreamed of eating. Hallucinations became common. The boundary between sleep and wakefulness blurred. By late November, the first bodies began to appear on the streets. These were not victims of the shelling. They were people who had simply run out of energy. They would sit down on a curb to rest, or lean against a wall, and simply never get up. Passers-by, too weak and focused on their own survival to help, would walk past. The social contract was fraying. The shared communal spirit of the early digging brigades was being eroded by the brutal instinct for self-preservation. The city was plunged into darkness. To conserve electricity, the power grid was shut down for residential areas. The trams stopped running. The trolleys sat frozen in the streets, rapidly buried by the accumulating snow. The only light came from the searchlights sweeping the sky for German bombers and the flashes of artillery. The city became a necropolis of ice and stone. The water supply began to fail. The main pumping stations were damaged or lacked power. The pipes froze and burst. People were forced to fetch water from the Neva River or the canals. This became a daily, tortured ritual. Women and children, bundled in rags, would drag sleds carrying buckets and pots down to the ice. They would find holes cut in the frozen river, slip and slide on the banks, and haul the freezing water back to their apartments, spilling precious drops that instantly turned to ice on the pavement. Information became scarce. The radio, a wired loudspeaker found in most apartments and on street corners, became the only connection to the collective. When there were no announcements, the radio played the sound of a metronome. A slow beat meant safety. A fast beat meant an air raid. The ticking of the metronome became the heartbeat of the dying city, a relentless countdown in the freezing dark. In the corridors of power, the desperation was palpable. Zhdanov and the military command tried to organize an evacuation across the lake before the ice was thick enough for trucks, but the boats were too few. They tried to fly in high-calorie concentrates, but the planes were shot down. They looked at the maps, at the German ring of steel, and realized the mathematical impossibility of their situation. The population was consuming tons of food a day, and only kilograms were arriving. As December loomed, the temperature plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius. The city was buried in snow that no one had the strength to clear. The snow covered the debris, the frozen trams, and the bodies that were now being left unburied in courtyards because the ground was too hard to dig. Inside the apartments, families huddled together for warmth, often sharing a bed. It was not uncommon for a person to wake up in the morning and find that the relative sleeping next to them had died during the night. The living were often too weak to move the dead, so they remained in the room, frozen solid, silent companions in the struggle for survival. The worst was not just the hunger or the cold, it was the isolation. The realization that just a few miles away, outside the ring, there was food, warmth, and life, but inside, there was only the slow, grinding extraction of life. The Germans did not need to attack. They just watched through their binoculars from the heights of the Pulkovo Observatory, waiting for the city to die. But the city was not dead yet. Under the crushing weight of the blockade, a new, terrifying resolve was forming. It was a resolve born not of hope, but of a refusal to grant the invaders the satisfaction of their extinction. Yet, as the calendar turned toward the deep winter, the people of Leningrad faced a question that went beyond politics or war. What does a human being become when the bread runs out? On the outskirts of the city, near the frozen shore of Lake Ladoga, a small team of engineers was inspecting the ice. They were measuring the thickness, calculating the load-bearing capacity of the frozen water. They were looking for a miracle on the ice, a fragile path that might sustain the weight of a truck. But the ice was shifting, treacherous and thin. And behind them, in the dark, frozen apartments of the city, The last crumbs of the sawdust bread were being consumed. The pantry was empty. The fire in the stove was dying, and the long, silent night of the blockade had only just begun. December 1941 did not arrive with the fanfare of holidays or the comfort of tradition. It arrived as a silent, white executioner. The city of Leningrad had ceased to look like a modern metropolis and had transformed into a prehistoric landscape of ice and ruins. The snow piled up against the first-floor windows of the grand apartment blocks on Nevsky Prospect, drifting over the abandoned trams that stood like iron mammoths frozen in mid-stride. There was no electricity to run the plows, and no fuel to melt the drifts. The temperature plummeted to 40 degrees below zero, a cold so absolute that it seemed to freeze time itself. Birds fell dead from the sky in mid-flight, their small bodies hitting the pavement with a sound like stones, but no one looked up. The citizens of Leningrad walked with their eyes fixed on the ground, searching. They were searching for a dropped ration card, a piece of wood, a scrap of leather, or perhaps, if they were lucky, a frozen cabbage leaf buried in the grey slush. The ration cut of November 20th had done exactly what the statisticians predicted it would do. It pushed the population over the edge of biological viability. The 125 grams of bread allotted to civilians was no longer food. It was a daily sacrament of survival, a sticky, dark clay that held the fragile line between life and death. The composition of this bread had evolved into a chemistry of desperation. By January 1942, the bread contained less than 50% rye flour. The rest was a mixture of additives that defied digestion. There was edible cellulose, a euphemism for pine sawdust treated with acid. There was cottonseed cake, normally used for cattle feed or ship fuel. There was dust shaken from the flour sacks. In some bakeries, they scraped the floors to gather the paste that had hardened on the tiles, grinding it back into the dough. Eating this ration became a ritual performed with religious intensity. In the freezing apartments, families would gather around the tiny burzoika stove. The head of the household would take the small, black brick of bread and a knife. The tension in the room would be palpable. Every crumb that fell from the knife was a tragedy. They would place a piece of paper under the cutting board to catch the dust. The bread was never eaten quickly. It was sliced into microscopic wafers. Mothers would instruct their children to suck on the bread, to let it dissolve slowly on the tongue to trick the stomach into feeling fuller for longer. Some toasted it on the stove to make it crunchy, hoping the texture would mimic a meal. Others dissolved it in hot water to create a murky soup. But no matter how they consumed it, the hunger returned within the hour, a sharp, physical pain that eventually dulled into a constant, lethargic ache. When the bread was gone, the hunt for substitutes began. The human stomach, driven by the primal urge to survive, forced the intellect to find calories in the inanimate. The city began to consume its own infrastructure. People remembered the joiner's glue used in furniture making and bookbinding. This glue was made from animal bones and hooves. It could be boiled. In the communal kitchens, pots bubbled with a foul-smelling, grey jelly made from wood glue. They added bay leaves or mustard, anything to mask the taste of rot and chemicals. It provided a meagre amount of protein, enough to keep a heart beating for another day. Then came the leather. In the closets of Leningrad hung heavy winter coats, belts, and boots made of pigskin or cowhide. These were no longer clothing, they were food. Families would cut up leather belts into small strips, boiling them for hours until they softened into a rubbery mastic. The tannins used to cure the leather made the broth bitter and toxic, often causing severe intestinal agony, but the sensation of chewing gave a psychological relief from the emptiness. The libraries, once the pride of the intelligentsia of the city, were raided not just for fuel, but for sustenance. The bindings of old encyclopedias and classics were ripped off and boiled for the paste that held the spines together. The Bardev warehouses, where the sugar had melted into the earth back in September, remained a pilgrimage site for the starving. Even in the depths of winter, with the ground frozen as hard as granite, skeletal figures could be seen hacking at the soil with pickaxes and crowbars. They were mining the sweet earth. This soil, black and oily with burnt sugar and carbon, was sold in the markets for 100 rubles a glass. At home, people would melt the frozen dirt, strain the mud through rags, and drink the dark, gritty water. It tasted of earth and fire, but it had calories. The desperation was such that the market value of this dirt exceeded the value of gold, jewelry, or fine art. As the hunger deepened, the domestic animals vanished. The cats and dogs of Leningrad, beloved pets that had slept on the beds of children, disappeared first from the streets and then from the homes. There was no malice in this, only a weeping necessity. A cat was known as a tiger on the roof in the grim slang of the market, and its meat could sustain a family for 3 days. Once the pets were gone, the rats were hunted. But even the rats, sensing the lack of refuse and food, began to migrate or die off, leaving the city to the humans and the lice. The cold was an enemy as formidable as the hunger. With the central heating systems destroyed and no coal arriving, the temperature inside the apartments equalized with the temperature outside. Walls were covered in hoarfrost. To sleep was to risk never waking up. People slept in their coats, hats, and felt boots, piled under mattresses and carpets. The burjuyka stoves were small, inefficient devourers of fuel. To feed them, Leningrad burned its history. Parquet floors were ripped up, antique chairs, grand pianos, and writing desks were chopped into kindling. In the Rumiantsev Museum, the staff huddled in the basement, burning the wooden display cases to save the exhibits, shivering as they chose which piece of the archive was expendable. The water infrastructure had collapsed completely. The pipes, frozen solid, burst in the walls, creating cascades of ice in the stairwells. To get water, one had to go to the Neva River or the Fontanka Canal. This journey, the trek for water, was a daily odyssey of pain. The banks of the river were slick sheets of ice. Emaciated women and children, dragging sleds with buckets, had to slide down to the ice holes cut in the river. The water was heavy. Lifting a full bucket required strength that many did not possess. Many slipped and spilled their precious cargo, the water freezing instantly on their clothes, turning their rags into icy armor that sucked the remaining heat from their bodies. Some fell into the holes and were too weak to pull themselves out, dragged under the ice by the current, their buckets still clutched in their hands. Hygiene vanished. There was no soap, no hot water, and no energy to wash. Lice infested everyone, from the factory worker to the university professor. The parasites thrived in the layers of dirty clothing that were never removed. Typhus began to stalk the shelters. The toilets in the apartments had long since frozen and ceased to function. People used buckets and poured the waste into the courtyards or down the elevator shafts. The city began to fill with frozen excrement, a ticking biological time bomb waiting for the spring thaw. In this frozen hell, the concept of death changed. It lost its sanctity and its shock. Death became a mundane, administrative event. It was everywhere. Bodies lay on the sidewalks, covered in a dusting of snow, looking like bundles of old rags. Pedestrians walked around them without breaking stride. There was no energy to mourn. If a loved one died at home, the survivors often kept the body in a spare room or on the balcony. This was partly because they lacked the strength to move it, but also for a darker, more pragmatic reason. They needed the ration card. As long as the death was not reported, the card remained valid for the rest of the month. The dead fed the living. When the bodies were finally moved, they were not taken in coffins. Wood was for burning, not burying. They were sewn into sheets or blankets and dragged on sleds belonging to children. The sight of a figure pulling a sled with a wrapped shape on it became the defining image of the siege. They were taken to the cemeteries, primarily the Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery, but the ground was too frozen to dig individual graves. Instead, sappers used dynamite to blast long trenches in the permafrost. The bodies were stacked like cordwood, layer upon layer, thousands upon thousands. Trucks would arrive, tip their beds, and slide a cascade of frozen corpses into the pits. There were no names, no markers, just the mass anonymity of extinction. Yet, amidst this apocalypse, a slender, fragile artery of life began to pulse. To the east, the vast expanse of Lake Ladoga had frozen. The Soviet command, realizing that the city would die before the new year without supplies, ordered the construction of an ice road. It was officially named Military Highway No. 101, but history would know it as the Road of Life. The construction was a feat of terrifying engineering. The ice conditions on Ladoga were notoriously unstable. The lake was deep, The currents were strong, and the weather was unpredictable. In late November, the first horse-drawn sleds tested the route. By December, the ice was thick enough for the GAZA trucks, the legendary Polu Orca, or 1.5-tonner. These trucks became the workhorses of the blockade. Driving the road of life was a suicide mission. The route was over 30 kilometers across an open sheet of ice, completely exposed to the German Luftwaffe. German Stuka dive bombers patrolled the lake, hunting the convoys. They would drop bombs to shatter the ice ahead of the trucks, sending them plunging into the black, freezing water. There was no cover, nowhere to hide. The drivers developed a specific, harrowing protocol. They drove with their doors removed or tied open. If the truck fell through the ice, the driver had a split second to jump clear before the vehicle sank. They drove at night, often with their headlights off to avoid attracting bombers, navigating by the faint white glow of the snow and the burning wreckage of the trucks that bad not made it. They drove at high speeds, not just to outrun the planes, but to outrun the physics of the ice. The heavy wave of water pressure created by the truck moving over the ice could snap the surface if they slowed down. The trucks carried flour and ammunition into the city. On the return trip, they carried the most precious cargo: people. Evacuation was the only hope for survival for the children and the elderly. But the journey out was as deadly as the siege itself. The trucks were open-topped. The evacuees sat in the back, huddled together, exposed to the -30-degree wind. Many who climbed into the trucks in Leningrad were frozen statues by the time they reached the eastern shore. The road was lined with frozen bodies that had fallen or been thrown from the trucks to lighten the load when the ice began to crack. Despite the heroic efforts of the drivers, the road of life could not immediately solve the hunger. The logistics were a nightmare. Snowstorms would bury the track for days, engines would freeze and crack. The volume of food arriving in January was barely enough to raise the rations slightly, but by then, the population was too far gone. The physiological damage of the hunger winter had set in. Even those who received a little more food often died because their bodies could no longer process nutrients. The dystrophy had reached an irreversible stage. It was in late January 1942 that the city reached its nadir. The official death toll for that month alone was nearly 100,000 people, though the true number was likely far higher. The NKVD and the militia struggled to maintain order, but the social fabric was tearing. Crimes of desperation surged. Theft of ration cards was common, often involving murder. If a person fell on the street, their pockets might be emptied before their heart stopped beating. And then there were the rumors. Whispers in the queues, stories of children disappearing, stories of meat patties being sold in the Haymarket that were not horse or dog. The authorities formed special squads to combat special category crimes. The details were suppressed, buried in secret files, but the reality was known. The taboo against consuming human flesh, the most ancient of laws, was being broken. It was not widespread banditry, but the madness of mothers watching their children starve, of insanity brought on by the complete collapse of the biological system. The city was looking into the abyss, and the abyss was looking back with a hungry, hollow stare. The psychological toll was as heavy as the physical one. The Leningrad stare became a recognized phenomenon. It was a fixed, unblinking gaze that looked through people rather than at them. It was the look of a mind that had shut down all non-essential functions to focus on a single coordinate, the next crumb of bread. Emotions were a luxury. Laughter was gone. Crying was rare because dehydration made tears impossible. There was only a grim, silent endurance. But even in this frozen tomb, humanity flickered. In the basement of the Hermitage, the staff lived among the empty frames of the masterpieces they had evacuated. They held lectures on art history for each other, describing the paintings from memory in the dark. In the radio house, the poets and musicians kept broadcasting. Olga Bergholz, the poet whose voice became the symbol of the city, spoke to the citizens through the loudspeakers. Her voice was weak, trembling with hunger, but she read poems about courage, about the spring that would surely come. She told them they were not forgotten. The orchestra of the radio committee, decimated by starvation, began to rehearse. The conductor, Karl Eliasberg, was so weak he had to be pulled to the studio on a sled, The musicians had to blow into their hands to warm them enough to hold their instruments. A trumpeter froze to death in the studio. But they kept playing. They were preparing a weapon more powerful than artillery. A symphony. As February arrived, the sun began to linger a little longer each day. The light shifted from the grey of the grave to a blinding, crisp white. The temperatures remained lethal, but the subtle change in the season brought a new, terrifying anxiety. The city was filled with thousands of tons of biological waste and unburied bodies hidden under the snow. The ice on Lake Ladoga, the only lifeline, would not last forever. The German command knew this too. They intensified the shelling, targeting the water pumping stations and the power plants, trying to break the city before the ice melted. They dropped leaflets mocking the starving citizens, promising them bread if they surrendered. But the leaflets were used for rolling tobacco or kindling. No one surrendered. The hatred for the invader had calcified into something harder than the ice. As March approached, the first drips of water began to fall from the icicles on the gutters. The sound was small, rhythmic, and terrifying. It signaled the end of the ice road. It signaled the thawing of the dead. The city lay broken, a skeleton of its former self, surrounded by enemies, rotting from within. The worst of the cold was over, but the true horror of what lay beneath the snow was about to be revealed. The spring thaw promised not rebirth, but pestilence, and as the ice on the lake began to groan and shift, threatening to swallow the trucks, the people of Leningrad realized that surviving the winter was only the first act of their suffering. The blockade was not lifting. The trap was still shut, and the mud of spring would bring a new, invisible killer to the streets. Spring in Leningrad usually heralded the return of life, the breaking of the ice on the Neva, and the soft northern light returning to the Baltics. But in March and April of 1942, the arrival of spring brought a terror arguably worse than the freezing cold. As the sun warmed the granite streets, the thick blanket of snow that had covered the city for 5 months began to recede. What emerged from beneath the white shroud was a landscape of horrors that had been suspended in cryonic preservation. The snow had hidden the waste of 1 million people living without sewage or plumbing. It had hidden the mountains of trash, the debris of bombed buildings, and, most horrifyingly, the bodies. Tens of thousands of corpses, left in courtyards or simply fallen in the snowdrifts, began to thaw. The city, which had been odorless in the deep freeze, began to emit a sweet, cloying scent of decomposition. The Soviet authorities and the medical leadership realized immediately that a new enemy was at the gates. It was not the Wehrmacht, but typhus, cholera, and dysentery. If the city did not clean itself, the biological time bomb would detonate, killing whoever had managed to survive the starvation. The order went out. The city must be scrubbed. What followed was one of the most remarkable feats of human endurance in history. The population of Leningrad was a collection of walking skeletons. These were people suffering from advanced dystrophy, scurvy, and pellagra. Most could barely lift a cup of water, yet they were mobilized. Armed with shovels, pickaxes, and crowbars, the women and teenagers of Leningrad took to the streets. It was an army of the dying cleaning the city for the living. They chipped away at the layers of frozen excrement and ice that coated the sidewalks. They cleared the courtyards of the unburied dead. They hauled the filth onto sleds and dragged it to the designated dumps. The work was agonizing. The caloric expenditure required to chip ice was immense, and the rations, though slightly improved by the ice road, were still critically low. Women would collapse over their shovels, their hearts giving out from the strain. But the work continued. By the end of April, over 12,000 tons of garbage and biological waste had been removed. The city was clean. The epidemic was averted. With the streets cleared, a sound returned to Leningrad that brought tears to the eyes of the survivors. On April 15, 1942, a bell rang out on Nevsky Prospect. It was the tram. The engineers had managed to repair the power lines and the tracks. When the first red and yellow tram rattled down the street, people stopped and wept. They touched the metal sides of the car as if it were a holy relic. The movement of the tram meant that the city was no longer paralyzed. It was the first mechanical heartbeat of a resurrection. However, the German siege lines had not moved. Army Group North was still entrenched, their artillery still zeroed in on the landmarks of the city. Hitler was furious that the city had not died during the winter. He ordered the shelling to intensify. The Luftwaffe shifted tactics, targeting the tram lines and the crowds that gathered at the stops. But the psychological war was about to take a turn that no military strategist could have predicted. In the depths of the city, in the freezing radio house, a resistance was forming that utilized violins instead of rifles. Dmitri Shostakovich, the most famous composer of the city, had begun writing a symphony during the first terrifying months of the siege. He had been evacuated, but his score found its way back to the city. It was the 7th Symphony, dedicated to Leningrad. The Soviet leadership decided that this symphony would be performed in the besieged city, broadcast live to the world, and, most importantly, played over loudspeakers directed at the German lines. The task fell to Karl Eliasberg, the conductor of the Leningrad Radio Orchestra. When he received the order, he looked at his roster. The orchestra effectively did not exist. Only 15 members of the original ensemble were still alive and in the city. The rest had starved to death or been killed at the front. Eliasberg himself was so weak from dystrophy that he could not walk. He was pulled to the studio on a sled. The rehearsals began in a cold, dark studio. It was a macabre scene. The musicians were wrapped in coats and gloves with the fingers cut off. The brass players did not have the lung capacity to blow their instruments. The effort made them dizzy, and they would faint. The drummers lacked the muscle mass to hold the rhythm. Eliasberg was ruthless. He secured extra rations for the musicians' hot soup and a little extra bread, but he demanded perfection. He knew that a weak performance would be a victory for German propaganda. They needed more musicians. The call went out to the front lines. Commanders were ordered to release any soldier who could play an orchestral instrument. Men were pulled from the trenches, gaunt and dirty, clutching clarinets and trombones, and sent into the city. They were an orchestra of ghosts, assembling for a concert in hell. The date was set for Sunday, August 9th, 1942. The date was chosen with vindictive precision. German propaganda had earlier boasted that on this very day, the fall of Leningrad would be complete, and Adolf Hitler had invited his generals to a victory banquet at the Astoria Hotel near St. Isaac's Cathedral. The invitations had even been printed. The Soviets intended to ruin the party. Before the first note could be played, the Red Army had to ensure the concert would not be interrupted by German shells. General Leonid Govorov, the commander of the Leningrad front, orchestrated a different kind of symphony. He launched Operation Squall. Minutes before the concert was to begin, every Soviet artillery piece in the sector opened fire on the known German battery positions. It was a massive, deafening barrage designed to force the German gunners into their bunkers and silence their cannons for the duration of the broadcast. As the thunder of the artillery faded, silence fell over the Grand Philharmonia Hall. The chandeliers, dusty but intact, were lit. The audience was a mixture of soldiers in uniform and civilians in their best, albeit loose-fitting, clothes. They looked like shadows of their former selves, but they sat with spines erect. Eliasberg raised his baton. The arms of the musicians, thin as sticks, lifted their instruments. The music began. The 7th Symphony is a massive, complex work. The first movement features the famous invasion theme, a repetitive, marching snare drum beat that grows louder and more grotesque, mimicking the mechanical advance of the Wehrmacht. It was the sound of war turned into music. The performance was broadcast live across the Soviet Union and to the West, but the most important audience was outside the city walls. Massive loudspeakers had been set up along the perimeter of the front lines, aimed directly at the German trenches. The music blasted across no man's land. For the German soldiers, starving in their own way in the mosquito-infested swamps, expecting the city to be a graveyard, the sound was terrifying. They heard a full orchestra playing a complex, powerful symphony with precision and passion. It shattered the narrative that Leningrad was dead. It told them that the Untermenschen, the subhumans they were told were eating each other, were capable of transcendent art. German soldiers later wrote in their diaries that it was the moment they realized they could not win the war. Inside the hall, as the final triumphant crash of the symphony echoed and faded, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then, The applause erupted. It was not polite clapping. It was a desperate, weeping ovation. People stood and cheered for an hour. The musicians, exhausted, some on the verge of collapse, wept with them. They had proven that the human spirit could not be starved out. But music, no matter how powerful, could not break the blockade. As 1942 turned into autumn, the reality of the siege remained. However, the situation was changing. The road of life across Lake Ladoga was now operating with industrial efficiency. During the summer, a pipeline and an electric cable had been laid on the bottom of the lake. Fuel and power were trickling back in. The rations improved. The bread became real bread again, without sawdust. The city was no longer starving to death, but it was still a prison. The strategic situation on the Eastern Front had shifted. The Germans had suffered a catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad in the south. The momentum of the war was turning. In Moscow, Stalin and the Stavka turned their eyes back to the north. It was time to break the ring. The plan was codenamed Operation Iskra, meaning spark. The objective was modest but critical. Not to lift the siege entirely, but to punch a hole in it. The target was the bottleneck, the narrow strip of land south of Lake Ladoga, where the German grip was thinnest, only about 15 kilometers wide. On one side was the Leningrad front, trapped inside the city. On the other was the Volkhov front, on the mainland. They would attack simultaneously and crush the German divisions between them. The offensive was set for January 1943. Once again, General Winter played his hand. The Neva River froze solid, providing a bridge for the Soviet infantry. General Govorov, a master of artillery, massed over 4,500 guns on the narrow sector. The density of fire was unprecedented. On the morning of January 12, 1943, the sky tore open. The Soviet artillery barrage was so intense that the ice on the Neva cracked and jumped. Following the wall of fire, the infantry of the Leningrad front surged across the frozen river. They carried assault ladders to scale the steep, ice-covered banks on the German side. As they ran across the white expanse, they were met with withering machine gun fire. Men fell in rows, their blood staining the ice in bright, shocking crimson contrasting with the white snow. But the wave was unstoppable. They reached the bank, climbed the ice walls, and engaged the Germans in brutal, hand-to-hand combat in the trenches. Simultaneously, from the east, the Volkhov front smashed into the German rear. The fighting was savage. The terrain was a nightmare of peat bogs, dense forests, and fortified strongpoints. The Germans, knowing that losing this strip meant the end of the blockade, fought with desperate fanaticism. For 6 days, the battle raged in the snow. On the morning of January 18, 1943, near Workers' Settlement, No. 1, the miracle happened. Soldiers of the 123rd Rifle Division from the Leningrad front saw figures approaching through the smoke and pine trees. They were wearing Red Army uniforms. They were the men of the 372nd Rifle Division from the Volkhov front. The two forces rushed toward each other. There were no speeches, just rough embraces, tears, and the shouting of, "Comrades! Brothers!" The ring was broken. A corridor had been opened. It was only 8 to 10 kilometers wide, a narrow throat of land filled with shell craters and burning forests. But it was a land link. The news flashed to the Kremlin and then to Leningrad. The loudspeakers in the city announced, "The blockade is broken." People rushed into the streets, hugging strangers. Flags appeared on the balconies. For the first time in nearly 500 days, they were reconnected to the body of the motherland. But the Soviet engineers knew that a corridor was useless without a railway. The road of life on the ice was temporary. They needed steel rails to bring in the massive amounts of food and ammunition required to sustain the city and the army. On January 19th, the day after the link-up, the order was given to build a railway through the newly captured corridor. It seemed an impossible task. The route had to cross frozen marshes and the Neva River. The ground was riddled with unexploded ordnance, and critically, the entire route was within easy range of German artillery on the Sinyavino Heights, which overlooked the corridor. The Germans could see the construction crews through their binoculars. They called it the Road of Victory, but the workers who built it called it the Corridor of Death. Thousands of railway troops and civilians, mostly women, were sent into the bog. They worked in freezing water up to their knees. They laid tracks on piles of frozen turf because there was no gravel. As they hammered the spikes, German shells rained down on them. A section of track would be destroyed, and the crews would rush in to repair it while the smoke was still clearing. They worked 24 hours a day, under searchlights at night, which only made them better targets. Yet, in a feat that defies modern comprehension, the 33-kilometre railway line was completed in just 17 days. On February 7, 1943, the first train chugged across the temporary bridge over the Neva and into Leningrad. It was not carrying tanks. It was carrying butter, grain, and, famously, a cargo of cats from Yaroslavl to deal with the rat plague. The arrival of the train at the Finland station was a scene of delirium. The locomotive was covered in pine boughs and banners. When the whistle blew a sound not heard for a year and a half, the crowd erupted. The siege was technically broken, but the map told a different story. The corridor was a tenuous thread. The Germans still held the high ground at Sinyavino, just a few miles south. They looked down on the trains passing through the corridor and treated them like toys in a shooting gallery. The trains had to run a gauntlet of fire. The living traffic lights were girls standing along the track with lanterns, signaling the engineers to stop or speed up depending on the shelling. And for the city itself, the breaking of the blockade brought a cruel paradox. The Germans, infuriated by the success of Operation Iskra and unable to starve the city into submission, changed their strategy. If they could not starve Leningrad, they would smash it. They moved their heaviest siege guns, including giant railway cannons captured from the French Maginot Line, closer to the perimeter. The shelling of Leningrad in 1943 became more intense, more systematic, and more ruthless than at any point during the starvation winter. The hunger was receding, but the violence was escalating. The safe sides of the streets were no longer safe. The shells fell on cinemas, on schools, on the very trams that had just been restored. The citizens of Leningrad, having survived the apocalypse of hunger, now had to survive the apocalypse of fire. The joy of January faded into the grim realization of a new reality. The blockade was pierced, but the war was far from over. The enemy was still watching, still waiting, and now they were angry. As the trains ran the gauntlet of death bringing bread, the gravediggers were busy again, not for the starved, but for the torn and the shattered. The city stood, but it was standing in a rain of steel, and deep in the German bunkers, the commanders were plotting their next move. They knew the Soviet corridor was narrow. They knew the railway was fragile. They began to amass forces for a counterstrike, a plan to sever the artery and plunge the city back into the darkness of isolation. The spring of 1943 would not be a season of relief, but a season of blood. The 900 days were far from finished. The true test of endurance was about to enter its final, most violent phase. By January 1944, the Siege of Leningrad had lasted for 872 days. The city that stood on the banks of the Neva was no longer the imperial capital of Peter the Great, nor was it the vibrant cradle of the revolution. It was a fortress of ice, scarred granite, and unyielding will. The population, whittled down by starvation and shelling, had hardened into something stronger than steel. The corridor of death, the railway link established a year prior, had kept the city alive, breathing a thin stream of supplies into the lungs of the metropolis. But existence was not life. The German 18th Army still sat on the perimeter, their heavy guns still within range of the Winter Palace, their observers still watching the tram lines through high-powered binoculars. The blockade was broken, but the siege was not lifted. The noose had been loosened, but it was still around the neck of the city. The Soviet High Command, the Stavka, decided that the winter of 1944 would be the season of judgment. The strategic situation had shifted irrevocably. The Red Army was pushing west across the entire Eastern Front. It was time to drive the Germans not just back, but away. The operation was codenamed January Thunder. Officially known as the Leningrad-Novgorod Offensive, the objective was total: the annihilation of the siege perimeter of Army Group North and the permanent lifting of the blockade. For weeks, the citizens of Leningrad watched the build-up. This time, it was different. In 1941, They had watched with dread as refugees poured in. Now, they watched with grim satisfaction as tanks, heavy artillery, and fresh divisions poured in through the narrow rail corridor and across the ice of the Gulf of Finland. The secrecy was paramount, but the energy was impossible to hide. The god of war, the Soviet artillery, was massing on a scale never before seen in the northern theatre. General Leonid Govorov, the meticulous artilleryman who commanded the Leningrad front, had devised a plan that relied on deception and overwhelming firepower. He moved the heavy Second Shock Army, commanded by General Ivan Fedyuninsky, to the Oranienbaum bridgehead, a small, isolated pocket of Soviet-held territory west of Leningrad, on the coast of the Gulf of Finland. The Germans had contained this pocket for years, considering it a nuisance but not a major threat. They were wrong. Under the cover of long winter nights, the Soviets transferred troops, tanks, and guns across the frozen Gulf to this beachhead. The Germans expected the main blow to come from the city itself. Govorov intended to stab them in the back. On the morning of January 14, 1944, the silence of the northern winter was shattered by a cataclysm. At 9:35 a.m., over 100,000 shells were unleashed upon the German positions facing the Oranienbaum bridgehead. The bombardment lasted for 65 minutes. It was a storm of fire that turned the frozen earth into a lunar landscape. The battleship guns of the Baltic Fleet, the coastal batteries at Kronstadt, and the heavy siege guns inside Leningrad all spoke at once. The German defences, the northern wall, they had spent 2.5 years fortifying with concrete bunkers and minefields, were pulverized. When the infantry of the Second Shock Army rose from the snow, they did not face a cohesive defense. They walked into a wasteland of stunned survivors and shattered concrete. The breakthrough was immediate. Simultaneously, the 42nd Army attacked from the Pulkovo Heights, south of the city. The two Soviet pincers were aiming to meet at Ropsha, encircling the German heavy artillery divisions that had tormented Leningrad for so long. For the citizens remaining in the city, the sound of the battle was terrifyingly loud, but the rhythm was different. It was not the incoming whistle of enemy shells, it was the outgoing roar of liberation. The ground trembled continuously. On the walls of the apartments, the picture frames rattled. People stood on the embankments, ignoring the cold, watching the flashes on the horizon. They knew, with an instinct honed by 3 years of war, that this was the end. By January 19th, the Soviet pincers snapped shut at Ropsha. The German 18th Army, the executioners of the blockade, began to collapse. The retreat was chaotic. As the Germans fled westward, they employed a scorched earth policy of barbaric thoroughness. They burned the historic palaces of Tsarskoye Selo and Pavlovsk. They cut down ancient trees in the parks. They blew up bridges and poisoned wells. The Amber Room, the legendary treasure of the Catherine Palace, was looted and vanished into the fog of war, never to be seen again. But the vandalism could not stop the Red Army. On January 27, 1944, the guns finally fell silent. The front line had been pushed nearly 100 kilometers away. The artillery of the Wehrmacht was either destroyed or captured. The siege was over. That evening, at 8 p.m., a sound was heard in Leningrad that had not been heard since before the war. It was not a siren, not an explosion, not the ticking of the metronome. It was a radio announcement. The voice of General Govorov read the order of the day. Citizens of Leningrad. The city of Leningrad has been completely liberated from the enemy blockade and from barbaric artillery shelling. Immediately following the announcement, the sky over the Neva River erupted in light. 324 cannons, positioned along the embankments and in the parks, fired a salute of 24 volleys. Tens of thousands of people poured onto the streets. They came out of the cellars, the bunkers, and the freezing apartments. They stood on the bridges and the frozen river. As the red, green, and gold flares illuminated the spire of the Admiralty and the dome of St. Isaac's, people did not cheer. They wept. They hugged strangers. They looked at the sky without fear. The blackout was lifted. For the first time in 900 days, lights appeared in the windows. It was a festival of tears. The morning of January 28th brought the harsh light of reality. The euphoria of the salute faded, replaced by the silence of the aftermath. The lifting of the siege allowed for a true accounting of what had happened. The statistics were difficult to comprehend. The Soviet Extraordinary State Commission later investigated the toll, but the true numbers remain a subject of historical debate. It is estimated that between 600,000 and 1.5 million civilians died during the siege. To put this into perspective, the death toll in Leningrad alone was greater than the combined total of all American and British military casualties during the entire Second World War. It was a city where 1 in 3 people had died. The majority had not died from bullets or bombs, but from the slow, agonizing calculation of calories. The physical destruction was total. 3,000 buildings had been completely destroyed. 7,000 more were damaged beyond repair. The infrastructure, water, sewage, electricity, transport was wrecked. The magnificent palaces of the Tsars, the suburbs of Peterhof and Pushkin, were shells of blackened brick. The cultural heritage of Russia had been used for target practice, but the deepest scars were on the people. The survivors were physically and mentally shattered. The Leningraders were distinct from other Soviet citizens. They moved slowly. They spoke quietly. They had an obsession with bread that would last for the rest of their lives. For decades after the war, a Leningrader could be identified by the way they treated food. They never threw away a crumb. If a piece of bread fell on the floor, they picked it up and kissed it. They hoarded dried crusts in pillowcases and drawers, a subconscious hedge against the return of the hunger. The story of the siege is best encapsulated not in the movements of armies, but in the diary of Tanya Savicheva. Tanya was an 11-year-old schoolgirl who lived on Vasilyevsky Island. During the first winter, she kept a small notebook. Her entries were short, factual, and devastating. Zhenya died on December 28th at 12 noon, 1941. Grandma died on the 25th of January at 3 p.m., 1942. Leka died on March 17th, 1942. Uncle Vasya died on April 13th at 2 a.m. Uncle Lesha died May 10th at 4 p.m. Mama on May 13th at 7:30 a.m. The Savichevs are dead. Everyone is dead. Only Tanya is left. Tanya was eventually evacuated, but she was too weak to survive. She died of progressive dystrophy in 1944, never knowing that her diary would become one of the most powerful indictments of war ever written, presented as evidence at the Nuremberg trials. The cleanup of the city took years. The bodies were so numerous that the Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery became the largest mass grave in modern history. Nearly 500,000 people lie there in long, grassy mounds marked only by the year. 1941, 1942, 1943. At the entrance, an eternal flame burns, and the granite wall bears the inscription by the poet Olga Bergholz, "No one is forgotten, nothing is forgotten." The return to normalcy was a slow, painful thaw. The evacuation orders were reversed, and people began to return from the Urals and Siberia. Families tried to reunite, often finding that their apartments were occupied by strangers or destroyed. The search for missing relatives, children sent on the ice road, husbands sent to the front, lasted for decades. The Red Cross and the police were overwhelmed with inquiries. The political aftermath was also complicated. Stalin, ever paranoid, grew suspicious of the Leningrad leadership. He feared that the unique experience of the city, its independence, and its solidarity during the siege made it a threat to his centralized power. In the late 1940s, the Leningrad affair saw the purge and execution of many of the leaders who had organized the defense of the city, including those who had managed the food distribution and the ice road. It was a final, cruel betrayal of the heroism of the city. Yet, the identity of the city could not be erased. On May 1st, 1945, Leningrad was named a Hero City, the first to receive such a distinction. The medal of the Gold Star was affixed to the flag of the city, but the true medal was the city itself. Leningrad had done what no other city in Europe had done. It had faced the full might of the Wehrmacht, intended for total extermination, and it had refused to die. The resilience of Leningrad changed the course of the war. By tying down Army Group North for 900 days, the city prevented those German divisions from being used to attack Moscow in 1941 or Stalingrad in 1942. The sacrifice of the starving civilians had bought time for the rest of the Soviet Union to arm and strike back. the city was a breakwater that shattered the wave of the Blitzkrieg. Today, the city is called St. Petersburg again. The scars of shrapnel are still visible on the columns of St. Isaac's Cathedral, and the clot horses on the Anichkov Bridge, deliberately left unrepaired as a memorial. On Nevsky Prospect, at house number 14, the blue stenciled sign remains, Citizens. During shelling, this side of the street is the most dangerous. People walk past it every day, tourists take photos, and life flows around it. But for those who know where to look, the ghosts of the blockade are everywhere. They are in the uneven ground of the parks where trenches were dug. They are in the silence of the Piskaryovskoye, and they are in the memory of the taste of bread made of sawdust and cellulose. The Siege of Leningrad was a descent into the absolute zero of the human condition. It showed how fragile civilization is, how quickly the veneer of society can be stripped away by hunger and cold. But it also showed the bedrock of the human spirit. When the food ran out, when the heat ran out, when the hope ran out, the people of Leningrad ate dirt, they boiled leather, they slept with the dead, and they held the line. They proved that a human being can endure the unendurable. They proved that a city is not made of stone and iron, but of the people who refuse to surrender it. In the end, the directive of Hitler to wipe the city from the face of the earth failed. The city stands. The music of Shostakovich still plays in the Philharmonia. The trams still run down the avenues, and the memory of the 900 days remains a warning and a testament to the price of survival. This concludes the story of the Siege of Leningrad. The history of the Second World War is filled with battles, but Leningrad stands alone as a tragedy of endurance. It is a story that demands to be remembered, not just for the scale of the death, but for the scale of the will to live. If you found this deep dive into history compelling, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you never miss a documentary. Like this video to help us share these important stories with a wider audience, and let us know in the comments what historical event you would like us to cover next. Thank you for watching.